Ukrainian democracy for 30 years has been chaotic, dynamic, and with unexpected turns of events. 2 revolutions, runaway ex-convict president, former comedian president, 9 re-election of parliament, and 24 cabinets of ministers. 30 years of Ukrainian politics. Part 1. Independence, democratic changes, and oligarchs. I want to share with you not just dates or facts, but to give more context that only someone who lived in the country for a long time can do. Our politics is in transition from Soviet Russian totalitarian past to national revival, democracy, and free market-based economy. So, Ukrainian political parties may call themselves right-wing, left-wing, or centrist. Most of them are rather centrist, but for many years they place on the scale of Ukrainian pro-European or pro-Russian remained the main factor. There will be 4 short videos about Ukrainian politics in chronological order. In this video, I will cover up the first 13 years, from 1991, when Ukraine became independent, to 2004. Collapse of the USSR. So, it's 1991 and Ukraine is finally independent, and the USSR collapsed. Why did it happen? There are so many reasons, but among them, ideology of communism was only on paper. In reality, it was fake. No one believed in these ideas for a long time. Second one, a planned economy was not viable. All production was carried out by order of the state and under the direction of the state. But more important, there were national liberation movement. 15 different republics, in each of which lived peoples very different in terms of history, culture, and religion. They were forcibly held in the one country. Also, each republic on paper, however, had local institutions, so the freedom of speech allowed a few years before in USSR aimed to modernize this country only helped to collapse of this monstrous state. In 1991, a number of Soviet republics declared independence, including Ukraine. Independence. So obviously the major political power at the moment was the Soviet communists, who were in the local government of Soviet Ukrainian Republic, and among them the soon-to-be the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk. Another major group was the People's Movement of Ukraine. It was the first oppositional party in Soviet Ukraine. They advocated the independence of Ukraine and were anti-Soviet. But the declaration of Ukraine's independence became possible thanks to the interest of both those groups. Soviet Ukrainian communists voted for independent Ukraine. Strange? I'll give you 3 reasons why. First one, they realized that USSR falling apart was inevitable. Second one, the communist elites considered independence as a prospect of ruling not just a part of the country with instruction from Moscow, but ruling an entire independent state. And third one, they were afraid to go against public sentiment. Since the beginning, no government in Ukraine could ignore mass protests. This is a very important part of Ukrainian political culture, which is simply today called Maidan, which means the square. That is, mass protests that traditionally take place in Kyiv on Maidan Nezalezhnosti or Independence Square. Already in 1919, even before the Declaration of Independence, civil society manifests itself. It was revolution on granite. That was mostly student protest campaign, which turned into more massive civil demonstration all over the country. The revolution on granite is viewed as the first major political protest centered on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, and further protest copies the style of this revolution. 4 months after the Declaration of Independence, on a referendum, 91% of voters supported the independence. The idea of Ukraine's independence finds the support of no less than 80% of citizens in all regions, except the Crimea, where support was still high, 54%. The first president. The first presidential election was held at the same time as the referendum. Having received more than 60% percentage of the voters, Leonid Kravchuk, until recently a member of the communist leadership of Soviet Ukraine, became the president. The main opponent from the National Democratic Forces, Vyacheslav Chernovil, collected 23% of the voters. The presidency of Leonid Kravchuk was remembered for the economical crisis, political instability and the miners' strike. On the other hand, during Kravchuk's presidency, the first 400 legislative acts were adopted. The armed force of Ukraine were formed, and Ukraine's independence was recognized by 171 countries. Kravchuk's historical role lies in his steadfast stand for the independence of Ukraine, which played an important role in the dismantling of the USSR, and most importantly, peacefully. It was his signature on the Belovezh Agreement on the termination of the USSR. In 1994, in response to dissatisfaction with the political situation in the country, President Kravchuk agreed to early presidential elections, which he lost to Leonid Kuchma, ex-prime minister and before that general director of a large Soviet-era industrial enterprise. It was then that the first democratic transfer of power took place, and this is exactly what distinguished Ukraine, where has never been a long one-man rule of the country, from most other post-Soviet states. It's President Kuchma who became the only acting president of Ukraine who managed to win election for a second time, establishing official and non-official state institutions. During Kuchma's first term was a number of economic reforms of varying degrees of success, but these reforms determined the modern economy of Ukraine. On the one hand, steps were taken towards the open market and integration of Ukraine into the world economy. Closer to the 200s, during Kuchma's second term, there was a noticeable improvement of the standard of living in the country. However, it was under Kuchma that conditions were created for the emergence of oligarchs, representatives of big business who at the same time have a significant influence on politics and their own media. Oligarchs were formed during privatization, the sale of state-owned enterprises to private owners. Because of the non-transparent privatization, the largest industrial enterprises of the USSR era were concentrated in the hands of a few men. In 1996, the Constitution of Ukraine was adopted, which was later amended several times in terms of the division of power between the parliament and the president. It is believed that the conflict between the branches of government, which often arises in Ukraine, is embedded in the constitution itself. Games with the constitution will still be used as a powerful tool in the political struggle. International politics. In the field of foreign policy, President Kuchma tried to implement a multi-vector policy, that is, to build relationship with both Western and Eastern partners at the same time. However, this tactic is assessed as a failure. Ukraine was left with nothing in both directions. The signing of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which recorded Ukraine's renunciation of nuclear weapons that had remained on its territory since the time of the USSR. It helped to establish relations with the West. Other signatories of the document, the USA, Great Britain, Russia, France and China, were supposed to guarantee the security of Ukraine. As we can see, this memorandum did not provide security for our country. One of the guarantors attacked Ukraine, and after all, a memorandum is a declarative document. Even then, serious problems appeared in relations with Russia. The Russian parliament declared claims on Sevastopol, a city in the Crimea, where large forces of the navy were stationed. In 1997, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was finally divided between two countries. Russia pressed and received not only more than 80% of the ships of the fleet, but also the right to base its forces in Sevastopol for 20 years. Second term of Kuchma and anti-presidential demonstration. When Kuchma ran for presidency for the second time in 1999, he abandoned the more pro-Russian slogans on which he ran for his first term and switched to pro-Ukrainian ones. This is a well-known paradox of many Ukrainian presidents in the future, who choose more patriotic rhetoric while in office. So Kuchma was elected for a second term, no longer due to voters from the east or south, but thanks to residents of the west and center of Ukraine who previously voted against him. One of the reasons Kuchma won the election is that his main opponent was a communist. At that time, Ukraine began to move away from predominantly socialist sentiments. At the same time, the most promising National Democratic candidate, Vyacheslav Chernovil, tragically died in car accident shortly before his elections. His supporters spoke of it as premeditated murder, but the case still remained uninvestigated. In the 202 parliamentary elections, the Communist Party did not win the most voters for the first time. The Democratic opposition won with more than 80% of voters. During the second term, President Kuchma began to concentrate more power around himself and showed signs of more authoritarian rule, which caused discontent among the opposition. However, the impetus for mass anti-presidential actions was the murder of the well-known opposition journalist Georgy Honhadze. The leader of the socialists, Alexander Moroz, made public in the parliament an audio recording of the negotiations, allegedly with the participation of President Kuchma, which indicated the alleged involvement in the murder of the journalist Gongadze. This was called the cassette scandal. Thousands of participants of the Ukraine without Kuchma actions demanded the resignation of the president. The tent city of protesters was destroyed after violent clashes between demonstrators and the police and mass arrests of activists. The tapes also contained information about the alleged supply of Ukrainian radio technical intelligence systems to Iraq with the participation of President Kuchma. And although evidence of such a sale was not demonstrated, it led to the isolation of Kuchma on the international stage. There is also a version that the FSB of Russia is behind the recording and leak of the president's conversation, which in this way sought to hinder Ukraine's integration into NATO. Whether it's true or not, Kuchma's isolation from Western partners pushes him to get closer to Russia, to participate in the single economic space. However, relations with Russia at this time were not perfect either. In the fall of 203, for several weeks, a crisis revealed to disputes over the ownerships of the Tuzla Island and the border between Ukraine and Russia. A strong opposition and strong potential president candidates have formed in the parliament. This will become the basis for the Orange Revolution. In the next video, watch the events of the revolution and the first pro-Western president of Ukraine. Thank you for watching this video. Stand with Ukraine!